Hello, this is Neal Matin, and for my final project, I'm doing a presentation on imaginative apologetics. And this is something that I was very interested in, something that I wanted to look at more. And so I hope this PowerPoint, this presentation is informative. So first, before we get any further, we have to define our terms. What is imaginative apologetics? It's a pretty broad term that I'm using here, but I'm hoping Dr. Halle Ordway's definition will do for us here. She says, imaginative apologetics, then, is the approach to apologetics and evangelization that brings the imagination into our work, sometimes through the use of the creative arts, literature, film, music, and art. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, specifically how apologetics are used through these mediums of literature, of the film, of music, and of the arts. And so as we look at imaginative apologetics, I have three other kind of sub-apologetics underneath them that we'll be looking at. The first, of course, is literary apologetics, and there we have the example, The Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. Then we'll be looking at aesthetic apologetics, and you'll see there the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo. How have Christians used the aesthetics, the arts, to portray the truths of God, the truths of the scriptures? And then number three, when we look at music, when we look at film and media, really we're looking also at a subset of cultural apologetics. Now I realize cultural apologetics could be its own presentation, its own 30-minute presentation all by itself. But for the purposes of this imaginative apologetics presentation, we're simply looking at specifically music and film, both in the Christian, as you'll see there, Christian rock there, but also in popular culture. And you see there kind of the movie Batman. How do we look at the world views that's being portrayed in film and media? So before we go any further, we have to ask, imaginative apologetics, why? And I have this awesome quote here by Hannah Zarr. She says this: imaginative and literary apologetics invites people into a story versus just trying to convince them of statements of doctrine that have been abstracted from context and rich meaning. Imagination is what enables people to see the story and imagine their place in it. And so too, as we get into this presentation and imaginative apologetics, always be asking the question, why this form or why this approach? And imaginative apologetics is a unique approach, but I think it's a very good approach, especially for the 21st century, especially for our culture today. And as we get into each of the various aspects of imaginative apologetics, I feel why we do imaginative apologetics is that through story, through the literature, through the arts, through film, through media, we can take people and put them inside the story, inside the music, and let them glean the truths of God in a different way than perhaps classical apologetics. And so, of course, as we go into first looking at literary apologetics in those three categories, if you remember, we have to mention C.S. Lewis and his literary apologetic. And so you'll see there in the corner his Chronicles of Narnia series, And I have a few quotes from his book as examples. This is how Lewis used literary apologetics, used imaginative apologetics in his writings, in his works, to get the ideas, to get the allegory and the motifs of Christianity and truth across. And so here's a quote as well from his Voyage of the Dawn Treader book. "This isn't Narnia, you know," sobbed Lucy. "It's you. We shan't meet you there, and how can we live, never meeting you?" "But you shall meet me, dear one," said Aslan. Are you there too, sir?" said Edmund. "I am," said Aslan. "But there I have another name. You must learn to know me by that name. This was the very reason why you were brought to Narnia, that by knowing me here for a little, you may know me better there." And so, of course, we know that one of the most enduring, one of the most popular approaches to literary apologetics comes from Lewis's character Aslan. And so we see there just a prime example of Lewis hinting at Aslan's true name and the motifs of both the character, but then also in reality, pointing to Christ. And of course, this is another one of the most popular quotes that often gets quoted here about Aslan, but again, you just see a part of a new aspect of God that you perhaps wouldn't consider or wouldn't look at apart from seeing this in a story. It just brings out this truth in such a unique way. And so, of course, this is told by Mr. Beaver in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. This quote here: "Safe?" said Mr. Beaver. "Don't you hear what Mrs. Beaver tells you? Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe. But he's good. He's the king, I tell you." And so again, we just see Lewis's creative work at displaying the unique attributes of God, but instead of doing it in a sermonizing way, he does it through dialogue and characters. Again, an excellent way of how to do literary apologetics. But now, of course, as Lewis did his famous Chronicles of Narnia series, if we would call that his positive literary apologetics, looking at Aslan, looking at all the characters, pointing more towards the Christ figure, here we have a different form of his literary apologetic in the Screwtape Letters, where he goes to the other side. He looks at perhaps what is it on the evil side, on Satan's side, on the demonic side, but also looking at the human heart, the human condition of sin, depravity in man, and how he uses this literary apologetic in a much different way than Narnia, but in a no less, in a very powerful way. So here we just have a quote from Uncle Screwtape here in his book. It says this: "For the presence of the enemy," meaning of course God, "otherwise experienced by men in prayer and sacrament, we substitute a merely probable, remote, shadowy, and uncouth figure, one who spoke a strange language and died a long time ago. Such an object cannot in fact be worshipped. Your affectionate Uncle Screwtape." So again, it's pointing towards a different way of looking at the truths of our human nature, our human experience, and perhaps how we even view God, or how we view prayer, how we come to God through sacrament, right? Do we see God as a strange, a shadowy figure, or is he real to us? And then this, again, another powerful quote spoken in the Screw Tape Letters. It's funny how mortals always picture us as putting things into their minds. In reality, our best work is done by keeping things out. And so again, here is Lewis using literary apologetics to challenge perhaps some of our own biases, perhaps our own Christian biases here of what does it mean to be tempted? Does it always mean things are put into our heads, or does it mean things are merely left out? Again, another quote by Annie Crawford, looking at literary apologetics. She says this: in this way, narrative art can sneak gospel truths past what Lewis calls the watchful dragons of bias or inhibition. Through the wonder and pleasure of a good story, a reader will imaginatively engage truths which, in another context, they would be likely to resist. And so I think, again, as we look at imaginative apologetics, and as we look at literary apologetics within that broader framework, we can see how useful it is, especially to bringing those who are skeptical or resistant to the gospel, to the truths of Christianity. This is a way that, as Andy Crawford mentioned, Lewis's comment there, the watchful dragons of bias or inhibition. We can kind of sneak gospel truths into the literature, into our work, and get them chewing on gospel truths that ordinarily they would just dismiss out of hand. And of course, Lewis isn't the only one, although I mentioned him. Other examples of classic literary apologetics. Of course, this is the Pilgrim's Progress, John Bunyan. What I would call an overt allegory. Of course, looking at the Christian themes, but in a very overt way. You know exactly what he's getting at when you pick up the book. But then also, other examples include fairy tales, Hans Christian Andersen, what I would call a bit subtler of an allegory. Again, you see Christian motifs, Christian allegories, characters that take on different personas of either Christ figures or themes of sacrifice, of redemption, of sin nature, those sorts of things. So it's a bit subtler than perhaps others, but at other times it can be quite frank as well. And of course, there are many, many others. We could look at Tolkien, we could look at Chesterton, we could look at so many other great literary apologists, but just due to time, I mentioned these examples to give us a closer look before we move on. And so, for further reading of literary apologetics, Holly Ordway, who we quoted earlier, who kind of gave us the classic definition of imaginative apologetics, has a book out called Apologetics and the Christian Imagination. And so for further reading, this is one resource you could look at, specifically looking at literary apologetics and Christian imaginative apologetics. Just a simple blurb here from the book is it shows how metaphor and narrative work in powerful ways to communicate the truth. It applies these concepts to specific key apologetics issues, including suffering, doubt, and longing for meaning and beauty. So again, it doesn't always have to be strictly an allegory, but it can be metaphors, it can be motifs, or specific apologetic issues. So instead of, for instance, the classical maybe argument for suffering, or the moral apologetic argument as Ravi Zacharias or William Lane Craig uses it, here we can look at suffering or doubt or longing, but in a very different literary way. Same argument, same truths, but we're getting at it through a different approach. And again, that's key to imaginative apologetics. It's not a different method, or it's not a different message, but it is a different method. It is a different approach to doing apologetics. All right, and now we'll look at the second aspect of imaginative apologetics. That's aesthetic apologetics. And aesthetics is the study of how beauty both embodies and points the way to truth. What we call art is the physical expression of aesthetic principles. Of course, there that quote by Aaron Zubia. Excuse me. And so we mentioned this before, but of course, one of the most famous, if you would say, aesthetic apologists is, of course, Michelangelo's The Sistine Chapel. And just his artwork that spans across time, across people groups. And again, as you just look at some of those pictures and some of those very famous paintings, the creation account, God and man, and as you look at this Sistine Chapel, things like that, you just see how he used art to display the wonder, the truths of God, or truths of the Christian faith. But not just him, also the church has used aesthetics as their apologetics for hundreds of years. As we look there at the simple stained glass window, but the intricacy of the story being displayed, Jesus, the disciples, you see the fishing boat, Christ making fishers of men out of the regular fishermen there. So again, the church has always used aesthetics, especially when the population was illiterate, when they weren't reading, they were still looking at the artwork, at the grandeur in the churches, in the cathedrals. And so even though they couldn't perhaps read in their own language for hundreds of years, the story or the literary narrative of the gospel, they were still getting the gospel message through aesthetics, through art, through pictures, through paintings, through stained glass windows, through these things that the church was doing to display these truths, these biblical, these gospel scenes, these gospel narratives, and these stories. And then here is just one example of some modern Christian art. You'll see there a picture of the Bible with the hand, all kinds of names on it, but in the middle is simply the word you. And again, that's looking at, based on Isaiah 49:16, see, I have engraved you on the palm of my hands, your walls are ever before me. So again, looking at perhaps some modern Christian art and how they use aesthetics as their biblical apologetic. And lest we not forget, we can't leave out nature's aesthetic apologetic. How does God use aesthetics? I think we would be remiss not to look at the canvas of the world as God's own apologetic of himself. And so we just have two things there: the sunset, the beautiful clouds looking at that, and then also the stars, that picture there, the celestial body. And we know from scripture that it says the heavens declare the glory of God. So not only are we using it, not only are artists using it, God himself has painted us a picture of himself through nature. And so again, I think probably one of the most enduring ways throughout humanity that mankind has seen into God's character and into God's nature is through the beauty, the majesty of the world around us. And again, for further reading, we have here simply a book, The Beauty of Faith, and just a little blurb from that offers a fresh perspective, arguing that beauty is the most compelling apologetic and suggests ways to implement such an approach. Joseph D. Woodell. Again, looking at specifically aesthetic apologetics and how compelling that really can be in getting the truths of God across, the beauty, the wonder, the nature of God. And lastly, we go to cultural apologetics. And Alistair McGrath just has a very poignant way of talking about apologetics. And so he says this: the best apologetics is done from the standpoint of the rich vision of reality characteristic of the Christian gospel, which gives rise to deeply realistic insights into human nature. What is our problem? What is our need? How can these needs be resolved? In each case, a powerful answer may be given to each question, an answer grounded in the Christian understanding of the nature of things. And so looking at that, specifically, how through music, through media, do we as Christians engage in imaginative apologetics, looking at the culture around us, looking at the cultural apologetics? So you'll see there, of course, the people at the rock concert. What is the nature of their lyrics? What's the nature of their songs? And then looking at the bottom, of course, Netflix. You know, what is the media, the film? As we look at popular media, what is their worldview? What is their cultural understanding of truth? So let's look at that a little bit more deeply. Of course, our first examples of this are in Christian music as our own kind of cultural apologetic. Again, pointing people through our own music, through our own media, through our own art and literature to the truths of God. And so here again is just a picture of a Christian band, 38th Parallel. They wrote a song called Who Am I? And so I just have a few lyrics from the song that point to their cultural apologetic through the medium of music, through their song lyrics. They say this: made like a mirror to reflect his glory, but the glass got smashed, bought a counterfeit story. We gave into pride, sacrificed life. On that day, we died inside. Outside, we ignited a rebellion, an infectious disease that labeled us felons, cold and alone, ever wandering in search of a home. So again, if we could think of Alistair McGrath's quote there for just a minute, what is the worldview? What are these questions? Who am I? Where am I going? What is the problem here? And so through Christian music, both good and bad, but nevertheless through music, Christians have done cultural apologetics to point to Christ, pointing to the nature of people and what we've got wrong, and then also pointing towards the truth of God. And then, of course, Christian music, old-fashioned hymn sing. Aaron Zubia, who we looked at before, has another great quote that's worth mentioning here. He says this: most Christians are accustomed to truth being communicated propositionally in a three-point sermon, for example. But artistic truth should be taken seriously as well. Art is powerful in penetrating our minds and spirits. That's why it's easier to recall the tune and lyrics to a theologically rich hymn than to remember the points of a sermon. So again, just looking at that, powerful stuff. How do we use our Christian apologetics, even in our own ministries, in our own context, to display the truths of God that can be remembered throughout the generations? And then, of course, Christian film. We have to mention the Passion of the Christ, looking at that as again, cultural apologetic, an imaginative apologetic, to be sure. It's one thing to read the biblical account, read the narrative, and imagine it, but through film, this was done in such a powerful way that Christians and others who had read the biblical account now all of a sudden had a different view of exactly what Christ experienced in a very real, a very gritty, a very raw way, but nonetheless using the medium of film to get across the message of the truth of Christ, the truth of his suffering on behalf of our sin. And then, of course, Christian film can get a bad rap for some of its films being maybe overtly classical in their approach, maybe a little less imaginative than we would like. However, they have put out many movies, and they continue to put out movies. There's just 4 of maybe some of the top ones that have come out in recent years through film and through media. But now, as we of course go over to popular media and film, as we look at imaginative apologetics, again, remember, is first and foremost an approach. So what is our cultural apologetic approach? And as you look here, there are 2 of the superheroes in our popular media and our film culture. Superman, looking at the heroic person, but then also the Dark Knight, taking the hero, but also giving him other qualities, other darker, maybe more human qualities than Superman had. But not just heroes, it also we look at villains as well. What does our culture say about what makes a good villain? First of all, villains are complex characters, and probably 2 of the most recognized villains are, as we have pictured there, the Joker and Darth Vader. Both classical villains in popular film and media. But when we look at these specifically, I think we can use imaginative apologetics to look at the culture of our popular media and film and what makes those people villains. What traits do they share? What is their worldview? Why do they do what they do? Why did they become evil? Was it their nature? Or what happened to them that made them this way? All these questions are questions that we asked as cultural apologists. And so as we watch these films, as we interact with our neighbors, certainly everyone has an opinion on the Joker and on Darth Vader. And two, looking at our music, of some of the most popular artists, what are the song lyrics of Drake and Imagine Dragons there? What are their worldview? What are they trying to portray through their media and film? We looked at Christian media, Christian music, and some examples of their lyrics, but what does the pop culture, what do they express? And as we, again, reflect on Alistair McGrath, what's their worldview look like? What are they longing for in their music and in their lyrics? We don't have time to dig into each of these for examples, but those are just some popular culture people, some bands, some music that we as Christians should be looking at apologetically. What's their worldview? And to dissect that both with one another and with others. And here for further reading, of course, Paul M. Gold, his book, Cultural Apologetics, for further reading for us. He says this, the cultural apologist is also deeply interested in the many worldviews found within culture and how they find expression in the cultural goods produced and consumed by others. So again, as we look at what is our cultural goods that we're consuming, especially when we look at the imaginative arts, when we look at film and media, what is the culture consuming? And what is the worldview that's wrapped up in those cultural goods? And then he continues here. The cultural apologist works to awaken those within culture to their deep-seated longings for goodness, truth, and beauty. And again, that's Paul M. Gold who wrote the book, Cultural Apologetics. So again, just to recap, imaginative apologetics. Imaginative apologetics then is, and as I underline this, the approach to apologetics and evangelization that, and here this is the key, brings the imagination into our work, sometimes through the use of the creative arts, literature, film, music, and art. And so as we've just gone very briefly, done an overview, we could spend much, much more time, of course, on each of these things, on literary apologetics, on aesthetic apologetics, on cultural apologetics, and how the popular culture uses imagination and worldview, and also how Christians use popular film and media. But then also, how do we engage the culture in their own worldview, their consumer goods, so to speak, and have an understanding of their longing of the heart and how we can speak into that. And so again, just as we recapped imaginative apologetics, as we briefly looked at literary apologetics, the examples of C.S. Lewis's Narnia, aesthetic apologetics, as we looked at Michelangelo's painting, the art work of the world, and as we looked at cultural apologetics, what does the Christian music movement mean for film and media, and what does the popular culture and their kind of icons of heroes and villains, and there are so many other things, but those are just examples that we've touched on how we approach imaginative apologetics. And so for the last slide here, our takeaway then. We asked the question in the beginning of this presentation, why we do imaginative apologetics, and now here is our takeaway. Imaginative apologetics is a unique approach to truth for the postmodern culture. And so I think truly, as Christians, if you want to engage in this postmodern culture, imaginative apologetics is one of the most promising, one of the most unique ways to do apologetics in the 21st century. And so that was a part of my interest, but also a part of my belief. We as Christians must use imagination in our apologetics. Now, that's not to throw away the classical approaches or the other approaches. That's not to throw away the place for formal debate. It's not obviously to throw away sermonizing and debate style apologetics. But also, though, let us not neglect imaginative apologetics. And so I have one final quote for us to ponder on, and that's this by Hannah Zarr. Apologetics often tend to focus on scientific and philosophical arguments for God's existence, but postmodernists hesitate to accept objective arguments from science or rationality, and instead draw predominantly from personal stories and experiences to figure out what's real. And so as we just look at that quote again, I think how unique imaginative apologetics can be to specifically fill the need of Christian apologetics in our postmodern culture. If they want to reject, if our culture in the 21st century wants to reject the scientific, the evidentialist-based claims of God, then let us instead draw them into a narrative story, draw them into the imagination, the deeper longings of the heart, the wonder, the beauty, and the majesty of God that imaginative apologetics can so uniquely point a person towards the truths of God and who He is. So that's my presentation. Thank you so much for listening and engaging with me in our look at imaginative apologetics. Thank you.